What's going on, everyone? Anthony Drew Gary here, host of the How To Show, where we talk about optimizing life, money, and happiness one how-to at a time. This week on the show, we're going to talk about credit scores. And the reason why is because over the last 10 so years of being an adult, I've heard everything from you don't need a credit score to you need a good credit score to it's important to it's not important to a credit score is really an I love debt score and anything in between. And so I want to spend some time this week breaking down how to maintain a credit score, how to build a credit score, and why it's important, why it's not, and maybe why you need it, why you don't. So to start from the beginning, the credit score is actually known as a FICO score, and that comes from the Fair Isaacs Company, and they are a company that measures credit worthiness. And so what they do is they create a score for every individual based on the data that exists for an individual to determine some accurate way to determine credit worthiness from person to person. And so the way they do this is they do it on a scoring system. Right now it's set up on a sliding range from 300 to 850. And so this is kind of like the SATs in high school. Just for putting your name on the paper, you get 300 points. And so that's the baseline. And then if you're a super overachiever, you get an 850 score. And we'll talk about the differences and how those numbers come together. But we want to think about this in such a way of why is this important to me? And so when it comes time to make big decisions in your life, whether it's trying to buy a house, trying to rent an apartment, trying to buy a car, things of that nature, there are certain circumstances in life where having a credit score is going to give you an advantage, or not having a credit score may complicate your life a little bit. And so just want to break these things down and spend a little bit of time talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly with credit scores. When it comes to determining a credit score, there are 5 main components that decide what someone's credit score is. And to make sure I hit each one of them accurately, we're going to list them off one by one. And so the first and the probably most important aspect of a credit score is your payment history. And this is basically the established documentation of you paying off your loans, your utilities, basically things that you owe. You want to have a consistent record of paying these things on time. And for the most part, bigger established debts or bigger established bills will report to the credit monitoring agencies, which then feed their information into what becomes your credit score. And so if you have a student loan, or if you have a mortgage, or if you have maybe a car loan, these are the types of things that you want to make sure you're paying on time, because these are the things that get funneled in to your credit score over time to show that you've been paying on these things consistently and that you haven't become unworthy based on your payment history for these types of items. Not so much if you borrow $100 from a friend and maybe you made a payment once and then you skipped a couple months, then you made another payment. Unless your friend has a direct line to the credit reporting institutions, that's probably not going to show up on your credit score or be reflective of your score. But make sure you pay your friend back. That's just good, important life lessons there. So the next thing that breaks down what compiles a credit score is how much you owe. And a different way to think about this is your credit utilization as a percentage or as a ratio. And so let's just say, for example, you have a credit card with a limit of $1,000, and that's your only opportunity to have debt right now. Just to make life simple, you have a $1,000 limit and you have a balance of $90. That $1,000 compared to that $90 is a really low ratio of credit utilization. You've got $1,000 available, you're only using $90. But let's compare that to somebody who has $1,000 worth of credit available and they have used $900 of it. It starts to change how the credit score will look at you just based on the fact that of the amount of credit you have available to you, you are using nearly the capacity of it. And so this is just something to keep in mind. You generally want to have a low credit utilization ratio. And so there are a couple of ways to do this. Number one is you can pay down your debts and keep the amount of debt that you have really low. Or number two, you can open additional accounts to get the overall credit availability higher, just to make a spread between what you have available to you as compared to what you actually owe on. And so if we continue this thought process, if somebody has that $900 credit balance on a $1,000 line, it's going to be treated differently than if somebody has a $900 balance and their line is $10,000 or $100,000. It's all relative to the amount of available credit that you have. And so credit utilization comes into a factor, probably not as important as your payment history, but it's on that next level of importance. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the length of your credit history. And so as a general rule, the longer you've had established accounts, the more favorably they're going to look in your benefit to have a higher score. If you have accounts that have been open for 5, 10, 15 years, they're going to be looked upon more favorably than accounts that have only been open maybe 6 months to a year. Just because you've been establishing that rapport, hopefully you've been paying it off consistently, as we've talked about already, and it's just another factor that starts to go into all of these things that make up a credit score. And so the next thing we'll talk about is types of accounts. And what I mean by this is there are different accounts that will be looked upon a little differently. And so a mortgage or maybe a student loan or maybe a car payment will be looked upon probably a little differently than if you have used a payday lender or something to that effect, or maybe you've gotten behind in some of your utility bills. Different types of debts are going to be looked upon differently, and it's not a clear-cut science as to which ones are looked upon more favorably. I just want to bring this to everybody's attention that they could mean different things to different folks when they're getting that credit score established. But to recap and harp on one thing to bring it home is that if you can pay your debts off, it's going to be to your benefit. And so the next thing we're going to talk about is how do you build a score. And before we do that, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about, do you need to build a score? And again, I've heard everything from no to yes to everything in between. And the reality is that your credit score is important pretty much only in the sense of, do you anticipate trying to draw upon new lines of credit? Do you plan to open a new credit card? Do you plan to go and get yourself a car loan? Do you plan to go and get yourself a mortgage? If the answer to all of those questions is no, then your credit score is probably not that important to you. You've got life on a scenario where you really don't need credit. But if the answer to those questions is yes, or if the answer to those questions any time in the next handful of years might be yes, it's probably a good idea to get some level of establishment with a credit score. Again, the easiest way to maintain your credit score and to make sure that it's at a high level when it comes time to draw on any new lines or make any life-changing decisions that revolve around credit is to make sure that you're making your payments. And so you want to have as good a payment history as you can. And ultimately, it needs to be as long as you can, based on the amount of time horizon that you've had an established account. So first and foremost, most important thing of this entire video is to make sure that if you have active debts, you're making the payments on them, so that those folks are hopefully reporting that information, that you are paying on time, you're paying as appropriate, and you are worthy of someone else lending you money. So let's look at this from a different scenario for a moment. Let's say that you're either really young or you don't have any debts outstanding right now, and so your credit score is either very low or maybe it's even undeterminable because you don't have enough credit history to get something off the ground, to get a good established credit number. There are some opportunities that I would consider low risk that might be able to get this off the ground. And I want to speak a little bit from personal experience here. And this is something that I did. It worked really well for me, so maybe it can work well for you. And basically, as soon as I turned 18, I went out and got myself a credit card. And right, wrong, or indifferent, the credit card companies, it was Capital One at the time, gave me a credit card based on the fact that I had a little part-time job and I was making, basically pennies an hour. It was a couple dollars an hour. It was basically a minimum wage job. But they gave me a credit card, and they gave me a really low limit, which was frankly generous at the time. They gave me a $250 limit. And so what I did is I used that credit card, basically as a debit card in my mind. I trained myself that it was important to me to not spend anything that I didn't have, so I treated it like a debit card, as if it was coming straight out of my checking account when I was making the purchase, and then I was paying it off quickly. I wasn't waiting until the end of the month, just paying it off as it happened. But what I did that was important here is that I didn't go crazy on it. The only thing that I was buying with this credit card was gas for my gas tank in my car. And so habitually over time, I got to the point where a couple of years into college, I had a credit card that I had for 2, 3, 4 years at the time that I had paid off every month because I was buying gas. I was paying it off onward and onward. Some months I used it a couple of times, some months I didn't use it at all, just based on how much I was driving. But I had a credit line where when it came time to purchase a house, which was a year or two after college, it was established already that I had a credit card that had been around for, I think it was 5 or 6 years already at the time. And that basically paved the way for me to get a mortgage without a whole lot of trouble, because I had a credit score established. Somebody could look back and say, hey, this guy has had a credit account open for 6 years. He's paid it on time, albeit it wasn't fancy. It wasn't a lot of money either. They did raise the credit limit over time, but it's really not important for the aspect of the story that I was just buying gas with it, just paying it back. And so ultimately it was a good way to get the credit off the ground. And so again, treating your credit cards as if they're debit cards is a good way to further that thought process in getting that credit score up off the ground. The last thing that I want to talk about here is, again, the range for credit scores. And so they range from 300 all the way up to 850. But I want to spend some time talking about the law of diminishing returns here. And what I mean by this is that based on all of the research that I have done, if you are trying to get a car loan, a mortgage, any sort of perky credit card that maybe has rewards to it that are reserved for specifically people with high credit scores, basically, if you have a credit score that is above 700, you are going to qualify for the best of all the different opportunities you might have in front of you. And so I know that there are friends of mine, people in the personal finance community that really try to game the system and get their credit score as close to 850 as they can. But the reality is that as long as you're above 700, you're going to take advantage of all of the perks set up by the credit worthiness system. And so I want to urge you that there is no reason to lose sleep if your score is 720 versus 730, if your score is 760 versus 770. The incremental benefit of anything basically over 700 starts to become inconsequential in the big scheme of life. And so after all of this has been said, you might be thinking, how do I check my credit score? A fantastic question. There are a couple of different ways that you can do this. Some of them are free services, some of them are paid services. I don't personally recommend that you pay for your credit score, but a couple of the ways that I'm familiar with are either websites that feature these types of things. I think Credit Karma is doing something like this, where you either get it for free once or you get it for free a couple of times, and then you can pay for continuous monitoring, I believe. Or there are a handful of credit cards that will tell you your credit score either every month or every so often, or they will notify you when it changes and you can take a look at it. So if you are anticipating making a big life decision that might involve some sort of debt in the next handful of months to years, it might be important to start looking at your credit score now to make sure there aren't any surprises when you go to make that credit application later on. Just want to go in eyes wide open to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward there. That is going to bring this episode of the show to a close. As always, if you are one of the 2 or 3 people that have made it to this point in the episode, I appreciate you. And if you did, hit the like button so that somebody else knows in the YouTube algorithm world to share this video with anybody who might be stumbling upon YouTube with their free time, or maybe they're in some sort of boring finance class and they can learn some personal finance that's really important to them. If you are a subscriber to the show, go ahead and hit the like button. Leave me a comment. Let me know that you're watching. If you got any ideas for future topics of the show, you can leave those there as well. Or if you have any feedback for this episode, leave that, and I will respond to all of those. And if you know anybody who listens to podcasts instead of watches the YouTube channel, you can find me on the podcast player of your choice. search Anthony Drew Gary or The How To Show. Until next time, this is Anthony Drew Gary, host of The How To Show, signing off.